Jim, who's your MVP for July 1st?
Okay, I don't like the question.
Oh,
Because,
forgive me.
well, now,
I didn't know that was an option.
it's like saying, who's your favorite child? You know, all you guys have pointed out people who are heroes here. Hancock, Howard, Buford, Meade to some extent. It's like Little Round Top.
Yeah.
You know, Chamberlain, great. But if it weren't for Vincent, Chamberlain would have been there. And if it weren't for Warren, Vincent wouldn't have been there. Why do we have to pick one guy? I mean, why can't we give
don't.
him credit?
Addressing Gettysburg.
Live on SD Card from the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, it's Addressing Gettysburg's 162nd anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg Town Hall, where you, the audience, are just as important as the host and the expert guest. Tonight's guest historians are licensed battlefield guide Jim Pangburn and historian Codie Eash. And now, here's your host, Matt Calorie.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this anniversary episode of Addressing Gettysburg. This is the July 1st anniversary episode. In the audience is a select group of patrons and listeners who are really at the top of the class, if you will. If there was a class, they'd be at the top. They know their stuff, and so we're going to get right into a discussion about July 1st. Joining me today on my right is the great Jim Pangburn, licensed battlefield guide. And from the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, Codie Eash, historian extraordinaire. So we're going to start with, here's something I want to know from everybody. And just feel free to talk. July 1st, when you think of the whole Battle of Gettysburg, and then you think of it day by day, July 1st, how do you characterize it in your head compared to everything else you know? Like how do you picture it? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Opening ceremony.
Opening ceremony.
Yeah, kickoff.
Kickoff.
First quarter.
Okay.
Right, all sports analogies that Matt won't get.
I'm completely lost.
Good job on that. That's very good.
First quarter of the year that I'm thinking of paying my quarterly taxes. So, okay, but so it's the kickoff. How about if you were to characterize it though, like as maybe a mood or I'm not thinking of the word,
Chaotic.
right? What's that? Chaotic. Yeah. Confusion.
Yeah.
It's a little less organized.
Act and react. There doesn't seem to be a lot of planning going on here. It's each side are reacting and escalating as the day goes on.
Yes, I like that. Act and react. How about the leadership on July 1st as compared to the other 2 days?
What leadership?
Oh, what leadership, says Elaine. Yeah.
A bit of a mixed bag there, partially because, again, it's that act and react chaos. Everyone's trying to make sense of what's going on, and their developments are happening in such a way that's forcing decisions from certain individuals or not some individuals to not make decisions.
Yeah.
According to how the circumstances are playing out.
Yeah, and this 3 days prior, you already had a shift in the army to begin with. And then shortly they're here, Reynolds is dead. Another shift. So it's like if there wasn't already confusion to begin with, now on top of that, we got that going on. Right?
Dead Reynolds. So, okay, so you've got, before we get to Dead Reynolds though, I think we've got Buford. To me, before Reynolds comes on the scene, the only person within, let's say, a 10-mile radius no, because he's within that. But the only person between Gettysburg and Cashtown who seems to be exhibiting any sense of leadership is John Buford. Agree, disagree?
Well, let's caveat that, though.
Caveat it then.
Because Buford has a plan, and he works the plan, he holds on to the plan. And I'm looking at Jim, the minute Reynolds, there's no planning involved. Everybody's, to Mike's point, reacting.
Yeah, and also I would say here too, Buford is making calls and making decisions, but it's all within the framework of, are we going to receive that infantry support coming up? Because everything he does is contingent upon receiving that infantry support. If that infantry support doesn't come up before he's knocked off the ridges, it doesn't matter what he does. He's not ordered to hold this place at all hazards.
Right.
It's a defensive posture for sure, but he's not here to sacrifice his cavalry division.
We had years ago Tom Vossler and Jeff McCausland on the show, and they wrote a book, which of course is escaping me because this just came into my head and I didn't write it down. What's the name of their book? Do you remember?
Was it A Guide to Gettysburg?
No.
It was like a leadership book.
It's a leadership book. Yeah. It'll come to me. Anyway, in the book, when we're talking about Buford, they talk about how he's leading the boss, right? His boss, his immediate boss, the closest vicinity boss is Reynolds. Mm-hmm. And he's sending back information and reports, and he's not saying you got to get your ass over here, but he's kind of very strongly suggesting.
And that's the thing. He's doing his job.
Yeah.
He was up here to go to Gettysburg to find Lee's army. That's part of his role. I characterize Civil War army on the advance as kind of like a bug, and the cavalry is kind of like the antennae of that bug.
Okay.
Buford is being the antennae. He's doing his job. He's found Lee's army. The decision to fight here in a bigger fight is not really in his hands. He's just buying the time so someone can make that decision.
Was his job to fight, though? Was it this, as the bug analogy, was it the sting? Or was it just the recon?
It was,
I think definitely
This is-
when you come across him, you're like, oh, I gotta do something here. I can't just let recon.
Let
I
them
can't stay
come
back.
to this town?
I gotta figure out something to do here because
So
they gotta
he
slow up.
He might have an objective according to his orders, but then he has to be able to decide on the ground when the situation is developing.
dictates.
What do I do?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's so great about Buford is like he's not just going, oh yeah, they're coming to Gettysburg. He's like, we're gonna stop them, and we're gonna wait, or we're gonna slow them, and we're gonna wait for the infantry to come so we could stop them.
He's a middle manager.
He's a middle manager.
He's a middle manager. He has to manage up. He's managing up to Reynolds. You got to manage down to the people he has. And middle managers typically are the ones that have to react quickly without long-term strategy or planning.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he creates a strategy for what he's going to do, but he created that strategy on the fly. It's not like he said the day before, tomorrow this is going to happen and we're going to do this. No, it started to happen. He came up with an immediate plan and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then he managed from there until the next, till Reynolds came for his short time, but until the infantry came up and then other decisions were made.
And a question I have for Jen or Cody, what conversations, do we have any surviving record of what conversations went on between Buford and Reynolds? Do we have any paper trail? Do we have any accounts that tell us what that's going on? What is the information being passed between the two of them?
Cody and I
what
just
are
did a
decisions?
show about that sort of thing not too long ago.
Yeah, so what's going on
Once
there?
Reynolds is taken out of the equation too, that communication line seems to be taken out.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, now we're back to square one.
Yeah, so the question is on the night of like the 30th, and that's where this is, he's making this decision, Buford's making the decision to fight, okay? What is he communicating with Reynolds? What's Reynolds communicating with him?
Yep. So the big one that appears in the official records is the 10:20 or 10:30 p.m. message on June 30th, where, as I always like to say, it's the message where it's almost as if Buford has just read a history of the Battle of Gettysburg and is explaining what happened, because it's incredibly accurate in its placement of which divisions are in which direction that he's up against, and it's the basis of the scene in the book The Killer Angels and then the movie Gettysburg of Sam Elliott right out here on the bench in front of the seminary building, explaining to Reynolds that whole sequence. But what we oftentimes, I think, leave out of that story is Reynolds' lack of a direct response to Buford on one important point. And it's that Reynolds instead sends a message to, I believe it's Howard, if I'm not mistaken, saying about one particular piece of Buford's note, I do not believe him, is his words. And it's the point that there were Confederate forces northeast of Gettysburg, and specifically in East Berlin. He doesn't buy that Buford's intelligence is correct for whatever reason. He thinks that the entirety of the Army of Northern Virginia is west of Gettysburg. And so that cohesion that we oftentimes like to think about, that as soon as Reynolds arrives on the scene, it's these two leaders who are both rising to the occasion and they're both 100% on the same page. There's this weird sort of lingering thing in the background that we don't get a bow tied on that story because, of course, Reynolds doesn't survive the hour. And but that has always really kind of struck me as one curious piece of that communication. A, the lack of a direct response to Buford from Reynolds, and then B, the line there about not entirely believing him. And then there's also this question of, did Buford leave Gettysburg at any point that evening and actually meet with Reynolds? And that's sort of always been a cloudy piece of the historical record as far as whether there's actually some sort of a in-person communication just south of town that night. But what Matt said, that he and I just had this discussion recently, was all surrounding the man who's at the top of this building for most of June 30th and the morning of July 1st, Aaron Jerome, Buford's signal officer. And on the one hand, it's unfortunate that so much of what we know about the Buford-Reynolds dynamic only comes from one source, only comes from Aaron Jerome. So that's the negative, is that we have that single source for that story. But the plus side is that it exists at all. And I would contend there's a really good chance we're not sitting in a museum in this building right now if it's not for Aaron Jerome writing down everything that he did, that Buford is positioning him here, that he wants him to keep an eye out west for campfires and in the morning for dust, and that he's on the scene at the moment that Reynolds arrives and gives us at least one version. We can get into that story later, I'm sure, but one version of events of how that meeting plays out. But he's a central figure who connects so many dots between a lot of those first day players, between Buford and Reynolds, between Howard and Buford, between as each successive highest-ranking federal officers arriving on the field, Aaron Jerome and the seminary cupola can almost always be tied to some piece of that story.
Go ahead, Elaine.
So if I may, Jim, I'd be curious on your reaction, because a lot of people have said, this is the opening, this is the kickoff, this is what's starting. But that assumes that the coaches, the generals, are on the field directing this. How do you, tell me your point of view of how you view this. Is it just, okay, we finally met and we're kind of working ourselves out, and day 2 is the opening act, or is it day 1?
I've always thought day 1 was the key day. It's a tactical defeat for the Union Army, but I've always thought it was a strategic victory, because what the Union forces are doing out here is they're holding the Confederates off. They're protecting the better, higher ground south of town. They're giving the bulk of the Union Army, which did not fight here on day 1, the time to march up here. And then what happens on day 2 and 3? The Confederates attack the Fish Hook position. They're unable to drive the Union Army away. All that's made possible by what happens out here. The Union forces sacrificing 50% of their men, but protecting the higher ground south of town. The thing that I think is really interesting about Buford and Reynolds, I think you have to go all the way back to headquarters in Taneytown. One of the things that I found really interesting, one time I was down in Taneytown, and I found on the road just outside Taneytown on the way to Littlestown, General Meade's headquarters the night before the battle. What does that tell you? It tells you that Meade is planning to head toward Littlestown, Hanover, and York, because the last information he's got, he doesn't know exactly where the Confederate main body is, and that's what he's got to find. He's had reports of Confederates in Chambersburg, he's got them up here at Carlisle, and he's got them over at York. And it looks like the Army of the Potomac, most of it, 4 of the 7 corps, are actually almost heading to the northeast. But then Buford makes the contact here the day before the battle, sends a message back to Reynolds. And what's really interesting, I thought, is what Kent Masterson Brown said in his book, Meade at Gettysburg. Something that I'd seen before, but not a lot of people talk about. It said that probably what Meade was hoping to do, and what he had communicated to Reynolds, was just to come up here and make contact. Make contact with the Confederates, because then you force them to concentrate. Then you know where their whole force is, their main force. And then Reynolds is supposed to withdraw and draw the Confederates back toward Pipe Creek. But Reynolds gets killed right away, and Doubleday takes command. And he's not in the loop between Reynolds and Meade, and doesn't necessarily understand Meade's intentions.
Well, he's also not a wing commander, so he doesn't have the full.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. That's going to sit for a while.
And one thing too, that to add on to Jim's point, is when we think about the actions involving emergency militia in the days leading up to the battle here, of course there's the emergency militia standoff, whatever we want to call it, when Early comes through on the 26th. But where have basically all of the most significant military actions taken place to this point? Everything's east of here. Everything's in York County. It's Hanover Junction. It's Wrightsville. It's the surrender of the borough of York, now the city of York, the largest municipality that Confederate forces will take that surrenders to Confederate forces during the entire Civil War. So for Meade as a brand new Army commander, all of the attention, I think, rightfully so, and everything that's really taken place June 27th, 28th, 29th, we can see why, and in part, he's heavily concerned with these reports that are coming back of all of the relatively speaking, major military actions that had taken place into Pennsylvania up until that point. They're all at points east of here.
I have a question. So there was, of course, Confederates that came through here prior. Did any of them tell Lee this would be a good place to make a stand if it comes down to it? There's good high ground we could get on, and it'd be very hard for them to get us off it. In other words, like going back to like what really did happen. Sometimes what if helps me understand what did, right? Mm-hmm. So like Buford saw that this is good ground here that they could fight from, and it would be really hard for the Southerners to get them off of it. Did they think in reverse to that days prior? Was there any kind of thing about that?
I've never seen anything. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of interesting because the brigade that came through here on the 26th was, if I'm not mistaken, Gordon's brigade, Georgians. And I've always had kind of a special interest in Gordon. I did a program with Matt for addressing Gettysburg on Gordon, and I've never seen anything about Gordon saying anything back to headquarters, either Ewell or Lee, about the ground here.
Because he would have saw it. I mean, right? They would have saw it when he came through. Right.
I think they certainly would have saw Cemetery Hill, and I know when Sando was killed down Baltimore Pike from the entrance to the visitor center.
Yeah, it's right there.
They have some idea of the ground here.
Yeah, White's Comanches, right? So yeah, okay.
And I think at this point their main focus I think is on Harrisburg, capturing Harrisburg and securing the bridge and maybe getting over into Lancaster County.
And I think that's the big point here. Is again going off of what was said earlier, it looks like Meade is anticipating Lee is heading towards the Susquehanna.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's where Meade is kind of anticipating to a certain degree. And Lee is heading that direction. But one thing we haven't talked about so far that's crucial to July 1st is what happens on June 28th at the Pizza Hut over there in Chambersburg. Okay? With Lee having his cheesy breadsticks. Right? No wonder he had digestive issues here at Gettysburg. Key point. But is that he receives the information.
With all due respect to Pizza Hut.
Well, yeah. There goes the Pizza Hut sponsor.
Yeah, they're not going to sponsor the show now.
Off the list.
Is that Harrison, the scout, tells him that the Union Army is in Maryland, is Frederick. Much closer. And so going back to your question of would they have communicated the ground, I don't think so, because John B. Gordon is not a topographical engineer, so he's not going to report that back. But Lee is informing Cashtown because he's done this before. The Battle of South Mountain in 1862. He's affording himself the opportunity, bringing the army back together at Cashtown to be able to bounce back into the Cumberland Valley if he needs to, or to proceed forward onto Gettysburg. It opens up his options to deal with whatever's coming his way from the Union Army.
Also, though, these Confederate forces are going through many towns, and Gettysburg is just one of them. And to us, it's special, it's important. They don't know anything of it. It's just another town they're going through.
Right.
So that people would maybe make notes of different things. I don't know. It's like that question that I have when we were doing the show about the Gettysburg rebels with Tom McMillan. And I was like, there's 6 Gettysburg rebels in the Army of Northern Virginia. And not one officer thinks, hey, let's use one of these guys as a guide. Right. And so, but to me, that makes sense. But to them, they might not have thought they needed it, or for whatever reason, nobody did it. And so, yeah, I just think what makes the difference to us today isn't the way they were thinking then. Were you going to say something, Elaine?
I have a question, but I've heard people say, would you really want to out that you're from Pennsylvania if you're in a Southern troop? So,
But you've been fighting alongside them for all that time.
Like, you get guys together, I don't know, girls can be this way too. You just
I think
out, at the end, like you might have come.
Yeah, I mean, there's one in every crowd who'd be like, I ain't eating with that guy. I don't know. He's probably a traitor. But, I think guys, you prove your worth.
You're giving them a lot of benefit of the doubt. I'll give you that.
I don't know.
The question I actually want to pose is, I think we're all building up to how much noise there was. Like, Codie, you said, I don't believe to Howard, right? So I think it'd be interesting to hear from you guys, as you guys have looked at this and the ORs, et cetera, how much noise is there? Because I would assume there's much more, I'll call it noise or information coming from the Harrisburgs in York, because we all say, weren't you ready to go fight it out, right? Here, but I think the noise didn't say here was going to be the here.
It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, Buford is just basically screening the left wing. Trying to protect the Army from where they've heard the Confederates are over here in the mountains.
So they're figuring it out because
But they have other figuring out. Like,
it's got to be, like you're saying, noisy, right? All this information coming in. How much of it's real?
Yeah.
How much of it's true?
how much noise is so? When you guys look at it, where are you seeing a lot of the discussion happening, even in what's happening with Meade? Like how much? Because we get a lot of noise in our lives right now. So put us in the moment. On the 28th, 29th, what noise is coming into headquarters?
So I think Emmetsburg pops up probably almost more than any municipality as a key on the federal side, and that's why we really start to see the left wing concentrate around Emmetsburg. And I think a lot of that has to do with the influence of Reynolds personally. That's where he's most concerned, and that fits into that discussion with Buford over where Reynolds is concerned with defending. And for that matter, you see it's one of those classic cases of it's all over the place in the firsthand accounts. You can read any number of firsthand accounts, and these men talk about being up at dawn and they're making a fast move to Gettysburg, and if they personally see Reynolds on down, all these officers are anxious to get to Gettysburg. And then others are the total opposite. We thought it was a relatively leisurely walk. We weren't actually anticipating very much of a battle, and it's sort of all over the place, which is sort of interesting. But I think another thing that we don't often enough consider with the narrowing in on Gettysburg and the Gettysburg campaign is when we take a broader look out, and let's just say you're looking at the official records and you do a Control F keyword search in the Maryland campaign, in really all through 1862, through a good chunk of 1863, and then again in 64. Do a Control F search of Gettysburg, and you will find repeatedly this was always on the radar as a possible place where there could be an engagement. And the people of this town realize that as well, as is the case throughout all of South Central Pennsylvania. Today when you drive along Route 30, you go every 30 miles and you have the county seat, the larger town, Chambersburg, Gettysburg, York, Lancaster. All of them have sort of a cry wolf situation. Gettysburg especially, because you have Jeb Stuart's cavalry just a few miles to the west in Cashtown in 1862. Of course, June 26th of 63, there's a lot of this sort of relief feeling from local townspeople. And then you have, of course, in 1864, there's the threat, are we going to have another battle at Gettysburg when Chambersburg is burned? And so it's always one of those towns, one of many. Sharpsburg is this way as well. We see Sharpsburg pop up. Any of these sort of crossroads that are at the intersection, no matter how many roads it is, we talk about Gettysburg's 10, but all you need is two major roads. And there's a high likelihood that that's going to be a place of potential battle. And so
makes a lot of sense.
Gettysburg, Emmetsburg, York, anything within this sort of 30-ish mile radius, that's where you're seeing a lot of mentions. Be on the lookout. That's a
That's
possible.
what you're saying. So the Southern Army, their idea wasn't converge and fight yet. It was get supplies, cause some fear and havoc. The converging thing happened because it had to happen because they were, or they didn't know they were. So the Union was way farther than they thought. That's why they converged. That kind of happened quicker than they expected to be doing that, is what you're getting at. Mm-hmm. Okay, got you.
Yeah.
Well, like that, in Troy Harmon's book, almost my takeaway on it is almost argues that Gettysburg is almost a magnet. Like the roads, the waterways, railroad gets here, but not quite. But all of those things almost make Gettysburg a magnet. So even though they didn't say ahead of time, we're going to go to Gettysburg to fight a battle, everything that was here just kind of drew it together. I mean, really, Chambersburg saw way more action throughout the war than anywhere else in the North did. Chambersburg had Confederates in it, what, 3 times? 4 times?
Yeah.
I mean, because Jeff Stewart came here in '62.
They didn't make a movie about Chambersburg.
They didn't make a movie about Chambersburg.
No.
Yeah.
Not yet. Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, how about on the Confederate side? We're talking a lot of Union stuff here, but what about the Confederates? What's going on with them? We talk about Buford being a good leader. Who's up against him, and how would you say they are as leaders? No, I mean directly, not Stewart. I mean,
P. Hill.
on June 30th and July 1st, who's Buford facing, and how would you? I don't know. What would you say about them, Jim?
Well, he's facing A.P. Hill. He's a new Corps commander. 2 of the 3 Corps commanders in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia are brand new. First time. Both of them had been division commanders of about 8,000 men. Now suddenly they're commanding 20,000 men, which is why Lee divided his corps into 3 instead of 2, because before you had Jackson and Longstreet commanding 40,000 men each. Yeah. And you don't want to bring a division commander of 8,000 men suddenly and give him a 40,000 man command. So it is interesting that the 2 corps that actually fight here on day 1 are new corps commanders.
Yeah. Well, and do you think we make too much of that they're new to Corps Command? They're not new to the Army. They're not new to command itself. They've got a few more men than they did before. Quite a few, but still, do we make too much of that now, or do you think that's kind of, I don't know, maybe lost cause excuse making, or do you think that's legitimate?
I think it's legitimate.
You do? Yeah, Eric seemed to agree that it's legitimate too.
I think it's legitimate if you look at what they came from to what they are now. They were both under Jackson, who was very specific, very detailed about the orders that he was given, and they were used to that. Now they're Corps commanders who are getting, if practicable. Everything about their orders are if practicable.
Discretionary.
So it's all discretionary stuff. It's very vague with the idea that as Corps commanders, they're going to go and make the decision. But yet, yesterday, not literally, but right before the last action that they saw, they had a commander that basically told them, you will wake up at 5 a.m., you will brush your teeth at 5:02, you're gonna do this, and they didn't have any of that discretion because they were told what they were gonna do. That's the biggest, like any of us as human beings, that's a major change in how you function.
And didn't people talk about
Thank you for projecting.
If you're late, you're arrested.
Lee is not a micromanager. He said, I'll bring the army to the field, and then I turn it over to my generals. And you've got Jackson, who's just the opposite. He, just as you mentioned, he gives specific orders. And that's what we talk about here at Gettysburg when people ask about Ewell not pursuing at the end of day 1. Well, here you've got Lee who gives general orders. You got Jackson who gives very specific orders. You take him out of the equation. Now you got Ewell, who's used to taking, just as you said, specific orders. And just as you mentioned, Lee's saying, take those hills if practicable, but do not bring on a general engagement. Here's Ewell scratching his head. So I understand that, and we talk about that. I think that had a big effect on what's going on here.
One thing too that I think, we've had a lot of sports references so far. One way that I like to think about this is workplace references. So when you think about, even for anybody who's ever moved up in a role within your company, wherever you work, even though it's the same workplace, there's new responsibilities to learn, new things that you weren't doing before that you have to get used to not doing, and new things that you are responsible for that you have to get used to doing for the first time, new people who you're reporting to, and always more responsibility as you're going through the ranks. And so I think that that's one way to just think about it, like you said, from the human perspective, is just think about it, in your own workplace. And likewise, another way that becomes really relevant, and we're talking about all the noise that's happening, is there are all of these official pieces of correspondence that are happening, that if we think about those as our emails with our colleagues. But the thing that's out of the historical record are all of the conversations, the personal conversations that are happening in between those pieces of correspondence. Think about all the emails that you send during a day, but then all of the conversations that are never going to be written down, that of just the water cooler conversations or in someone's office or at a desk. And that's a way that, those are the things that will have to pop up in the post-war accounts after the fact.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Because, and I'm going to throw this out for contradiction, but I interpret day one all about biases and misunderstanding. Because whether it's Pettigrew, there's a bias against his information. Yeah. There's a bias to Heath. Mm-hmm. There's a bias. Like, use your workplace analogy. How much if somebody picks up the phone and goes, there's a problem, you just take them at their word. You don't second guess. You don't do it. You don't dig into it. Versus somebody else who calls and goes, there's a problem. You're like, right. Sure, yeah. Right? There's a lot of that going on here. And the reason I say it and why I personally come back to the battlefield almost to challenge where I am and how I think through my day job is because it's a nice way to shine a light on, we all come to the world with biases. We're human, we have biases. And so to me, day one is full on biases and assumptions that are made until reality just hits them in the face.
That's a good, before we move on to that, Mike, though. So she mentioned Pettigrew and the biases against him. For the sake of people watching at home who might be new to all this stuff and aren't as, well versed as this crowd, go into that story there with Pettigrew and what he had to face.
Pettigrew's a brigade commander in Heath's division, a couple thousand North Carolinians, and basically what's happening on the 29th of June is we're waiting for the Confederate forces that have been north of here up to Carlisle and east of here over York to rejoin Lee's army. Lee has learned that the Union Army is at Frederick, Maryland. They've crossed Potomac River, and that they're within about a 2 days march of here. And Lee is concerned that his army spread out all around Gettysburg could be defeated in a tail, or the enemy could jump on a piece of his army, and he knows ultimately he's going to be outnumbered. So he's got his lead elements at the foot of the mountain over here at Carlisle, and these guys are just basically killing time, waiting for the rest of the Union Army, or Confederate Army, to join them. And they're reading newspapers, and they happen to see that there's a sale on shoes in this town called Gettysburg. So they decided to send a couple thousand guys down to Chambersburg Pike to see what was here, but they were told specifically, if you run into a Union presence, don't fight them. The army's not concentrated. We're not ready for a battle. Just turn around, go back, and report what you've seen. So Pettigrew does exactly what he's ordered to do. He meets Buford out here. He turns around, he goes to the back, and reports it to his division commander, Heath, and he goes to A.P. Hill, the corps commander. And they don't believe it's the vanguard of the Army of the Potomac. They think, a few days before Gordon came through here and ran in militia, think that's what it is. It's militia. So we'll come back tomorrow, but instead of instead of one brigade, we'll send 2 brigades, and we'll sweep whatever's there aside, march into Gettysburg, gather supplies. So Stuart's cavalry's not here. They're marching blind, infantry right into cavalry, and they stumble into a battle they're really not ready to fight, what the military would refer to as a meeting engagement.
So Pettigrew gets back to his commander, Heath.
Yeah, and that's right. Thanks for that. I should have mentioned that. Pettigrew believes. He believes he's seen Army of the Potomac. He believes this is the vanguard, just the way he sees basically the way they're handling themselves.
Because he gets to basically hear, right?
Within sight of Buford's
and
men.
he can see them coming, from the south of town, right? Out the Emmitsburg Road?
Yeah, and coming right out here, Chambersburg Road. So he goes back and he tells Heath, I think this is the Army of the Potomac. They don't believe Pettigrew. They think it's local militia, so they're coming back the next day with 2 different brigades.
Now, wouldn't Buford have flags and stuff with him showing that they weren't militia?
Yeah, and wouldn't they march a certain way that would not look like militia
and he
too?
would have saw that, right?
Yeah.
They definitely had flags. They weren't militia.
Well, and you know what happened on June 26th with militia? They see the Confederate infantry coming and they just run.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas these guys are not running. That's going to tell you something.
And they didn't have flags with it and stuff either, right? They were just horseback and maybe a couple pop shots and got out of there.
They might have had a flag.
And we know Pettigrew's a smart guy.
Right.
Yes.
It seems to me they should have trusted his judgment.
Yeah.
When he
Well,
says,
there was even a point where he called over one of his staff officers who used to work under A.P. Hill, Lewis Young, and says, "Tell him." And Young tells him, and they still won't believe it.
They still don't believe it.
But is that kind of the same kind of, I don't know what you call it, maybe arrogance that got Howard into trouble at Chancellorsville, where there's information coming from below, but it's like, well, now that's never accurate. It's always the information from the top I have to follow.
Well, what does AP Hill say? I just come from General Lee, and he tells me the Union Army's in Middleburg.
Yeah.
Well, if he's talking about Middleburg, Maryland, it is reasonable to think that if Union infantry's at Middleburg, Maryland, there's a real good chance that Union cavalry's going to be up here at Gettysburg.
And it comes down to that failure of intelligence. Lee doesn't have the information, and that's filtering down to AP Hill, new Corps commander, to Henry Heath, new division commander.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing here with that third Corps is this is a new organization. It's a cobbled together corps of AP Hill's old light division, R.H. Anderson's division out of Longstreet's former corps, and then a kind of Franken division under Henry Heath of a combination of a couple of brigades and a couple of brigades from the AP Hill Light Division.
Yeah.
And so this is a very new organization within the Army of Northern Virginia, and they just so happen to be in the lead here.
But there's a culture difference. Eric, I'm going to go back to what you said, right? He just came out from being under Jackson. So what's his culture? Don't argue with the boss. So if you don't argue with the boss, if you don't argue with the boss, I'm not going to contradict Lee. So there is something failure in Lee's leadership where he doesn't want to push the envelope and actually allow for people to argue with him. Or he didn't get after Jackson because Jackson was just that wild rocket that you could throw and he would do what you wanted to do. Because you have, now I don't want to get into also sickness because I do think that comes into equation. And the reason I'm saying this, Codie, to what you said is if you take this and where do we pull from life lessons? How much are you as a leader feeling not good in that day, making assumptions and biases that aren't right because you aren't able to open your mind and actually think that what you're thinking, being humans and animals that we are, we always have the first reaction, that you're not making the right reaction.
Right.
Like if you're tired, you're sick, I'll say sick again because it comes in, you're hungry, you haven't slept well, because I need to say tired twice, and your boss says don't argue with me, what are you going to do? Guys, I'm tired, leave me alone, can I just sit here for a while? I'm going to, Lee said no, just whatever.
And I think that's one of the interesting things that I always, for all reading different things and listening to all this different stuff, one of the things that I'm taking away more and more is we judge all of them based on everything's hindsight, obviously. And we could say, well, why didn't they do this? This was the logical thing to do. They should have done this. But for some reason, and it kind of goes to what you said, we take away just human reactions. Everybody's humans then are
They're
the
little
same as
plastic
humans now.
army men that we move
human
around.
nature is human nature, and it's always been human nature, and it will always be human nature. We delay for whatever, we don't know what happened in that specific moment in time that made somebody not react the way we said, well, they should have reacted. It's obvious they should have done it. No, it's not obvious because you're not there. So little delays. Why do I not believe this person? Like you said, all the time there's somebody like, this person always complains. Like, I'm not going to listen. And I think to your point,
Or
you
I'm
think
tired, I don't want to listen to him, just get out of my hair.
But you think about how we all react in our own workplaces and our own day to day. This is, it's war. It's different. People are dying, but is it? It's their job. They're doing their job. They're going to react at the end of the day. They're going to react the same way we all do.
Yeah, that's why I'm glad you brought up this aspect, this sickness. Yeah, because you're talking about AP Hill there, but also Lee. He's got the diarrhea supposedly. So and I always,
they're all sick.
Everybody's sick, right?
But
They're all sleep deprived.
This is something that I always try to get back to is I try to bring it down to that toilet level because
Is that where we're going?
That's where we're going. No, because that's what affects everything. When you have the flu, what can you do? You can't do anything. Now, when you're like Lee, I'm sure a guy in Lee's position doesn't have the luxury of guys, I have a really bad stomach bug today. I'm going to lay down and I'll just say, you guys handle everything. You can't do that. His job never ends, right? So I love that you guys brought that up and that you kind of were discussing that because to me, that's everything. They're not these plastic soldiers. They're very real. They're very human. And they're in a high stress situation, both physically and mentally and spiritually, that none of us or few of us most of us who've never served can even come close to imagining. So that's very important part, I think, of in studying any of this stuff.
And the point as well, I think, if we're, the even then, not even just in hindsight now, the biggest of those army, little plastic army soldiers was Robert E. Lee. And anytime that you enter Lee into the equation, it's not just the marble man who he's fashioned as after the war, after his death, but in that moment, in the preceding year up to this point, already it's been solidified into the minds of just about every Confederate soldier or Confederate sympathizer that the fate of this attempt at a new nation rests entirely on his shoulders. And, just a couple weeks ago, obviously, the commemoration of the 160th anniversary of what we deem the end of the Civil War. It's not literally, but the moment that Robert E. Lee says at Appomattox, okay, I'm done, this army is done, that's the effective end of the Confederacy. And so if Lee says the army's at Middleburg, Maryland, then despite what anybody else says to the contrary, the army of the Potomac is at Middleburg, Maryland. And I think that that idea of the buck never does stop at Lee. And we see obviously the best example of that at Gettysburg is the end of the first day, jumping ahead in our story. But that becomes a game of blame everybody but Lee. And anybody who does blame Lee is ostracized, i.e. Longstreet. Yeah. And up until the rather recent, over the past 30 years, I'll call it, even in the historiography, it's taboo to lay any blame at the feet of Lee. And that's happening literally in 1863. It's not just a post-war memory thing. It's as these soldiers are going about their daily lives, they recognize that right, wrong, indifferent, the entire fate of what they're fighting for rests on the shoulders of this one person in many regards.
So this period from June 30th to the morning of July 1st is one of the more fascinating things for me when it comes to A.P. Hill's Corps and what's going on with it.
Okay, go.
Because the reality is Pettigrew's brigade came here on June 30th, but who's leading the advance on July 1st?
Not Pettigrew.
Not Pettigrew, it's James Archer.
The Archer, yeah.
And not only that.
Well, it's actually the artillery.
But it's James Archer, it's Davis, and then 2 battalions of artillery. Whoa, without cavalry support and screen, that's a pretty hefty force you're sending on the road that morning.
Sure.
So what is A.P. Hill's decision making? And this goes to, I think, one of the great mysteries of the Battle of Gettysburg is A.P. Hill. Mm-hmm. What is he thinking?
Yeah.
What is his decision-making process?
Well, maybe Elaine's right. He's thinking, I want to get to bed. I'm not feeling well.
But isn't he already in?
He's not feeling...
I don't know if he's
was A.P. Hill ever feeling good?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing, yeah. A.P. Hill, we don't know that for sure if he's not feeling well.
Didn't you have a show with Charlie Fennell talked about A.P. Hill and at the time he's dealing with a STD at the time and whatnot?
Yeah.
I think it was, it was Charlie.
No, I think that was Rick Schrader and Fran Fick.
Yeah, he's the medical guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and that doesn't sound fun.
No.
They didn't have penicillin back then, and he's lived with that his whole life. So, and I think what they were saying was that they think it was syphilis that he had, right?
He picked it up in New York apparently on the way back to West Point one time.
Stopped at the grocery store and got some syphilis. So wait, he got it in New York City when he was younger, right?
Yeah, he's had it.
And so he had it for this long time.
So at this point, I mean, that's a disease that progresses.
And this has been some time now.
Right.
Yeah, it's not like you get it and then just it gets worse.
No, it gets
I'm not
worse.
making excuses for him, but these are the facts.
No, but they're not excuses. They're reasons. They're and there's nothing wrong with that because they're human beings.
Right. It's something we have to take into account. Now, are his contemporaries and his subordinates writing about this? That, well, A.P. Hill's in bed again and I don't know what to do. No, they're not writing about that. But one of the interesting things about this is the great what ifs of what documents I would love to have.
Yeah.
I would love to have an A.P. Hill memoir.
Yeah.
Give me an A.P. Hill memoir. We're never going to get that.
Never going to happen.
Because he dies in those days of the war. But the reality is somewhere between that meeting with Pettigrew and the soldiers get on the march on July 1st, He decides to beef up the force that's heading to Gettysburg.
Was it
And
him?
yeah, it has to be him
Why?
because he's the one coordinating the Corps. It's not just.
Why couldn't it be Heath?
It's not Heath because Pender is following Heath.
You're saying, okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying he decides to beef up the force with Pender's division.
Yes.
So that's why, because Hill's in command of both. So Heath can request Pender, but he can't order Pender to follow him.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So AP Hill, only that decision's coming from Hill. So when was that made? Why was that made? These are some questions. I have to look at Hill's OR and be like, did he answer this anywhere? And he doesn't.
Does it? He doesn't. Okay.
What are we not
Really?
thinking about, Jim? Is
He says they're going to Gettysburg to forage.
One thing that I have wondered, and it's not provable, but just a theory, is that we have this message sent to Ewell and his division commanders, 28th, 29th, the bring your force to Gettysburg or Cashtown as circumstances dictate.
Yes.
Is that Ewell's Corps makes the most sense, of course, because they're the most distant from Longstreet and Hill. But is that something that other Corps commanders could have interpreted as? Does Hill think that it's the circumstances don't dictate that he be a Cashtown any longer for whatever reason? That Gettysburg is a more proper place to that's the place to be. Come to the road network, not the mountain pass. So just a theory.
Because AP Hill sends a message to Ewell. I'm going to Gettysburg. And Ewell goes, okay, cool.
Well, Ewell gets a message from Lee,
Yeah.
and Lee is telling him to prepare to move toward Cashtown because the Army's trying to concentrate there, but be prepared to turn toward Gettysburg as I forget the
As the
exact phraseology.
situation
As it
requires.
dictates. And Ewell's response that night up in Heidlersburg is,
Yes.
when can somebody in General Lee's staff write an intelligent
Yes.
order? So this whole business is happening here on day one where he's saying, take those hills if practicable. That's not the first indication that Ewell is confused with what
Flustered.
Lee wants.
Yeah.
And this is, again, I heard that somewhere along the line, I read somewhere along the line, that Hill had actually communicated with Ewell in some way between the 30th and the 1st saying, I'm heading to Gettysburg. And that's what convinces Ewell to start shifting down towards Gettysburg instead of towards Cashtown, because he's still in a position to make that decision to send Rhodes's division to Gettysburg.
Rhodes's division is headed toward Biglerville.
Yeah,
And it's once they get the word that the fighting's going on here that they turn and come.
yeah.
Well, is that how, in those movements you're talking about, is that why Allegheny Johnson gets so far? Like, is he heading towards Cashtown while the rest of Ewell's Corps?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Because I've always wondered, and I know we're getting a little bit, Allegheny Johnson doesn't come into the story until the evening.
Yeah.
And we get towards Culp's Hill, but Allegheny Johnson is like the Cashtown Pass, isn't he, Mike?
He's up there at Shippensburg in that general area, and he's coming down, I think, the Black Gap Road.
Yeah, he goes
He's
through
almost
Scotland
to
and-
Carlisle when
Yeah.
Lee decides to
Yeah.
concentrate here.
Yeah.
So the reason it's quicker for him to come back down to the Cumberland Valley than it is to go up to Carlisle
Exactly.
and come back down. And plus, Rhodes's
Exactly.
division is now blocking those roads coming from Carlisle.
Okay.
So they just figure it's quicker for Johnson to come back and, like you said, like go down the Black Gap Road. But then, of course, he gets caught behind Longstreet.
Yeah.
And am I correct in isn't there some sort of dispatch that Johnson's division also has some captured supplies in tow as well that they want to?
He
get
had
back to
the Corps artillery with him, all those wagons and all that,
Yeah. Okay.
which would have made it more difficult to move slower.
Yeah. I don't know. I was thinking that there was something that they're trying that it's practical as well to get what they can closer to the gap, as we see during the battle here. Of course, they're constantly concerned with what can we have at the gaps already for when we need to pull out of Pennsylvania. I couldn't remember the timetable there.
So we talked a lot about the pre-battle now. Let's get to the battle. Instead of McPherson's Woods and the railroad cut and all that stuff, why don't we talk a little bit about what happens over on the northern part of the Union 1st Corps line and the 11th Corps and all that stuff. So why don't you bring us up to the afternoon? Let's start in the afternoon.
Okay, so Reynolds has arrived. He's been killed, and Doubleday takes command, and the Confederates are pushed back across Willoughby Run. There's a lull in the battlefield. Howard comes onto the field, takes command, comes over Cemetery Hill, drops the reserve off at Cemetery Hill, 4,000 men, and is getting word that the Confederates are now coming from the north. So he moves north of town. Rhodes arrives close to noon from the north. He's coming toward the sound of the guns, arrives on Oak Hill, and he sees the forward elements of the 11th Corps actually approaching him from beyond the college up toward Oak Hill. And he said that the enemy being so rash as to attack him rather than, stand there and let them take the attack, he was going to seize the initiative and attack them first before they could come in and push him off that great position of Oak Hill.
So they're trying. The 11th Corps is trying to extend. Initially, they extend the line of the First Corps.
They're going to connect with the First Corps right, which is Robinson's division. It's up here in the Sheeds Woods, going all the way up to the Mummersburg Road. And then what Howard's going to do is extend the Union line across the north of town to oppose any Confederates coming in from the north, because Doubleday is going to have to handle what's coming from the west in the afternoon. Of course, in the afternoon, the Confederates are coming back with not 4,000 men. Two brigades are coming back with two divisions of 14,000 men. So Doubleday's got his hands full out here, and Howard's men are, the 11th Corps is covering the north of town.
So the fighting on the north of town, I guess the big story there, the big show there is what happens on Barlow's Knoll. Everybody likes to talk about that one. What's the deal with Francis Channing Barlow and his knoll, his famous knoll?
Well, my understanding is he was kind of in the low ground east of the Carlisle Road, kind of where the Adams County agricultural offices are. The old almshouse was located, and he's looking up at the high ground in front of him at Barlow's Knoll and thinking, "What if the enemy?" Does it remind you of Sickles? What if the enemy seizes that high ground in front of me? And I'm down here, I'm going to seize that high ground first. But the thing is, it moves him out of the division line. Shovsnovsky is further back along where Howard Avenue is today, and he's moving out to a very exposed position. And actually what was happening when he moved out there, he was actually getting around on Doles's left. He was actually almost starting to outflank Doles, who's coming down on the west side of Carlisle Pike. And things are not looking good for Rhodes's division, particularly Doles's brigade, until Early arrives on the Harrisburg Road. And then when Gordon comes down, now the tables have been turned.
Yeah.
Now it's Barlow that's getting flanked on the right.
And his division on that hill is how many men would you say? It's a small one, right?
His division?
Yeah.
Oh, geez, they had
3,000?
Howard had about 6,000 total out north of town.
It's less than 3,000.
It's less than 3,000.
It's actually the smallest effective division here, even behind the cavalry divisions.
Really? So what are we talking, like 2,500 or?
Talking about 26, somewhere in that.
2,600.
Yeah, 26
for a division. And then Early's division is how long? Or how many?
Rhodes's was the biggest division in the Confederate Army, had about 8,000 men. I think Early probably had maybe 7,000 roughly.
So, yeah. So there's this little division of 2,500 men out on this pimple, right? And then this sea of Confederates is coming towards them, and they don't even need to all get online to swallow them up. And
they're being completely outflanked.
Right.
Now, I'm not from this area, so I don't know the layout of the roads and stuff that I can't see or not normally taken. Is there a road behind that mountain there? Or did you say
What
Carlisle
mountain?
Pike? Is that behind the mountains, like, say, like when you're looking for, like, Doles came down, the Peace Light Memorial, where Barlow's Knoll is?
Oh.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
a hill.
There's a road back there
There's a
that they came off of?
They're coming down the Carlisle Pike, essentially.
Yeah.
They're coming off
and
what's
Hers
called
Ridge Road, right?
Keckler's Hill, I believe it is.
Yeah, something like that.
And that
Okay,
really
there's a road
becomes
that went
Oak
back
Hill.
there. Okay.
But they're coming in pretty much an open plain.
I think what was it they used though to come, because he didn't take, if I'm not mistaken, do you know the route Rhodes Division took? I feel like I was told at one point they took some of the Carlisle Road, someone on the Hers Ridge Road, and then there was like a farm lane or something that I don't think exists anymore that would put them, if they cut off Hers Ridge Road, it would take them right to the back of Oak Hill. And so they would be essentially coming out of the woods that are there now. And I don't know what was there at the time. I forget who told me that, but I might be wrong. Does that sound familiar? Oh, that's true.
No, and they are coming like pretty much onto the Mummersburg Road.
Yeah.
And then coming out onto Oak Hill.
Okay. Oh, so okay. So they are taking the Mummersburg Road then. They're not cutting corners.
They're kind of coming out of the woods onto the Mummersburg Road.
Oh, gotcha,
And then kind
gotcha,
of
yeah,
deploying
right.
on Oak
All
Hill
right,
where
so I
the
was
Peace
right.
Light is today.
But you bring up a good point, and maybe we should talk about this a little bit here, is terrain. The terrain of the first day's battlefield and how important it is for the thing. So forgive me, I meant to do this before. Let's rewind a little bit to the morning phase of the battle, because to me, that's the better terrain. Go into that. How Buford uses it.
What we have out here west of town is what we call a valley and ridge province of Pennsylvania. It's a series of rolling ridges. It's what Buford uses to buy time for Reynolds to get here. Two major things he does. He dismounts his cavalry, has them fight behind fence rails. Buford's men have carbines, shorter rifles, but they're breech loaders. So he can have his men crouch down behind fences and reload the rifle while protected. Whereas the infantry coming at you has to stand to load the rifles. The trade-off, of course, is that the infantry longer rifles can take Buford's men under fire at greater range and he can return it. But his job isn't to stop the Confederates, just to slow them down. And then the other thing he does is he uses the lay of the land. As he's pressured from one ridge, he can fall back to another. Her Ridge to McPherson Ridge, to East McPherson Ridge, and if he'd had to, he could have fallen back here, but Reynolds arrives. You go north of town, whole different ball game. You weren't kidding about terrain, Matt.
Right.
It is flat and it is open out there, and I always feel bad about Howard's 11th Corps,
I do too.
because they are fighting a whole different ball game out there in that flat open ground than
Right.
than First Corps fighting here.
And Barlow is right, because if the Confederates could get that hill, they can get their artillery on there and they can fire on their line, right? But then you also have Oak Hill where there's batteries and they can fire down onto the plain on Howard's men. So I would never want to be Howard in that position. And it's why, like, the 11th Corps does get a bad rap. And I think, among other things, we were talking about Longstreet and Lee and Meade. People are taking new looks at them, and I think a more fair-minded look at them. And I think the 11th Corps is starting to get its due.
It's the Corps that everybody hated, even their own leaders.
Yeah.
I think James Pulis done a great work on a Crescent, to really get that kind of understanding of the Crescent Moon series, the volumes 1 and 2, to kind of bring that rehabilitation effort to the 11th Corps.
And they deserve it.
And I would say even Howard himself, though I'm in the middle of in my master's program, I'm doing a big historiographical study of Howard right now and how he's been treated over time, sort of splitting into three categories: his Civil War service, his Reconstruction era service leading the Freedmen's Bureau, and then his service in the West, especially in the Nez Perce War. But I have found that even in the Civil War, you can break it into three sections. It's pre-Chancellorsville, Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, Western Theater. And we really do, because of the emphasis that Gettysburg gets. But I think that has sort of expanded out to just Civil War aficionados as a whole. We judge Oliver Otis Howard on 2 days of service. We judge him from May 2nd, 1863 and July 1st, 1863. And in an otherwise commendable career.
Those are two pretty bad days.
They are. They certainly are.
What did you say?
I said they're two pretty bad days.
Yes, they are. But it doesn't excuse that. He's a Medal of Honor recipient, an early Medal of Honor recipient at that for Fair Oaks, who has lost an arm, and then he will become the commander under Sherman, who Sherman commends the most in the aftermath of the war. And even as early as 1863, I believe it's Sherman, if I'm not mistaken, who's writing a note that he says, essentially, I'm keeping an eye on this Oliver Howard. I think that he'll make an army commander someday, and he is by the end of the war. And it becomes a no-brainer because of his abolitionist beliefs and his success in the West. He becomes a no-brainer to put in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, which, for all of his best efforts, it ultimately fails, but he puts forth his best effort in it. And he's a complicated figure who I think that as time has gone on, much like his corps has received its more due credit, he has a negative impression of that corps, of course, and they of him, the enlisted men of him, especially him replacing a very popular commander in Franz Sigel. But if we take the broader picture out, one could make the argument that aside from Robert E. Lee in the broad scope of American history, Oliver Howard is possibly the most consequential general officer on this field, just when we look over the course of of American history overall. George Custer would be another person in that contention. I would
That's
say.
what makes it sad, though, is that like that is a great career that he had, and we just remember him for
Yep.
2 days.
Yeah.
He did leave the division. I mean, if he didn't leave the division,
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
I mean, he
Yes.
did something
Yeah.
right.
Yes.
That's
Oh, that he left the
Yeah,
division
that's what
on
I'm saying.
Cemetery
Yeah,
Hill.
he's-
Yeah,
he's-
Exactly.
yeah.
exactly.
At Digital History Pioneers Foundation, we are about grassroots history on digital platforms. That means we are about podcasters, documentarians, YouTubers, and even TikTokers. All of these creators are out there trying to share their love of history with the public. They don't need ideas, they need funding, both from viewers and corporate donors. DH Pioneer's initial funding focus is on the Civil War era, with a special emphasis on the Addressing Gettysburg podcast. So be a vital part of the unique content Addressing Gettysburg has in store by donating at dhpioneers.com and help bring your love of history to the people. Digital History Pioneers is an IRS Section 501c3 approved charitable corporation that makes any donation tax deductible to the fullest extent of the law.
The proof that Howard is responsible for the Union Army rallying on Cemetery Hill is the reserve he left there.
Absolutely.
That proves that he saw that as a rally point
Foresight.
before he even went north of town. And no one ever talks about that.
Right.
Who else was thinking
We
a
do,
couple
Jim.
steps ahead?
We do. We talk about it.
Howard was one of the only generals thinking a step ahead, or one of the only generals.
Yeah.
For what if?
And-
Doubleday wasn't.
Yeah.
Not in my knowledge.
And also, he's taking over command of a situation he didn't ask to take command of. 'Cause
Sure.
Reynolds is killed, and he's informed, guess what? This is yours now.
Yeah.
You get to stage manage this fight. And what he's doing is he's going to sacrifice his corps, the 11th Corps, to do a much, I think in my opinion, a much bigger job than what Buford's doing of buying time.
Yeah.
He's buying time north
Yeah.
and west of
That's a
town
good point.
and falling back to Cemetery Hill and falling back to Culp's Hill as they did. I think it's a tough deal from the poor 11th Corps, but I find it difficult putting myself in his shoes not to make the same call. I think I probably would make the same call.
Yeah,
that
of
he
course. But that's a good point, though, is he's doing what Buford's doing. Difference being Buford had like a garden hose worth of water coming out, and Howard's got to hold off against a torrent, like a flood, like a Johnstown flood he's got more to play. And it's a good thing he's got infantry, not cavalry, because he can actually do something with it. And they, of course, are going to get shattered. But go ahead. Yeah.
So the first Corps is dealing with those ridges west of town, which are probably easier to defend to a certain degree, but it's a numbers game because they don't have the numbers to hold, even with as good ground as they do have. The 11th Corps, which was already the smallest corps in the Army of the Potomac, now is leaving a third of itself back on Cemetery Hill, now has to cover a big area that's flat and cover roads. It's like a stretched rubber band.
Yes. Yeah.
What happens with a
Yes.
stretched rubber band? You pick it in a certain spot,
It snaps. Yeah.
And that's what happens to the poor 11th.
Well, and so the fighting around the seminary here is it more of a precarious position because the two roads that flank the seminary, the Fairfield Road and the Chambersburg Road, are getting closer together, and these Confederates are coming in on these roads. And so when you're further out and the roads are further apart, you're less, not that you're not a danger to the Union position, whatever it may be, but you're less of one. They have more time to see you maybe coming and respond. But now things are getting smaller. Everything's getting funneled in. Is that one of the things that plays into everything here?
It's part of it, and I think to tie together a couple of things here too, to geography of the battlefield and the use of the seminary is a couple of things we don't always consider. I think one is the multiple uses of this campus and this building. We know it for two primary reasons: one, the cupola as an observation post, and two, as a hospital, which we typically associate with post-battle, but bear in mind, as the fighting is swirling around this building, this is already in use as the first official hospital on the battlefield. 8th Illinois Cavalry had set up with Dr. Abner Hard an aid station. He utilizes the word hospital after the war when he's writing the regimental history. But Dr. George New, the 1st Division, 1st Corps Surgeon in Chief, he had established the first actual field hospital on the battlefield, which becomes a general hospital in the aftermath as well. So that's one purpose that this building overall is most famous for. But throughout the day, there had also been that the seminary is this reserve space in much the same way as Cemetery Hill is that fallback point for the division that Howard leaves behind. Seminary Ridge always has at least one regiment on this position. At one point, it's an entire brigade. It's Gabriel Paul's brigade who are building a barricade, which is how we first see Abner Doubleday's impact really being made upon the battlefield. And of course, we're going to have talked earlier about these the biases that people have with one another. That's the big one on the federal side is Howard versus Doubleday and how they thought about this day in contradicting ways. But at the seminary, you have this constant ebb and flow of movement, medical, signal staff, infantry, eventually artillery. At least 21 guns are up here by the time that the final attack is made against this position. And as all of that is happening, to bring up a name I brought up earlier in Aaron Jerome, who is the centerpiece to the story of Buford and Reynolds meeting one another, he's also the centerpiece to understanding how it is that federal officers know what they know and when they know it with regard to connecting what's happening west of town to what's happening north of town. Because he's up there until right about the time that the 11th Corps is starting to arrive in earnest on the field. And it's Jerome who had first seen elements of Rhodes's division coming down the Carlisle Road, and he signals, he probably personally takes a message, is my belief, that he goes to Cemetery Hill and he tells Howard that there's a division of rebels arriving on our right. It extends over a mile. There's nothing but cavalry to oppose it. We have Abner Small from the 16th Maine is right here on Seminary Ridge helping build this barricade. And he remembers looking up at the cupola, and he can see what he calls several officers anxiously pointing to the north. So we can see that these infantrymen are seeing the signal officers reacting, and that's when they go off to Oak Ridge, and the fighting escalates to the north of town. And then Howard, in his official report, and again in his memoir, he'll talk about the significance of the aid of Buford. And I think that he means that both in the literal sense of Buford's cavalry holding the flanks, but also in terms of information sharing and gathering. And it goes back to his signal officer here. So there's this ubiquity to the fact that all of the information that's swirling around it comes here, from here or to here. And I think the other thing that as this is all happening that Howard should get proper credit for is what's the big critique against him on May 2nd at Chancellorsville? It's that he disbelieves almost every piece of information that comes back to him. But here, he's reacting ahead of time by putting the division back on Cemetery Hills we talked about. But he's also accepting of the fact that, for a while he's in overall field command, but then also accepting of the fact that there's a point in time when he's not, when he'll be superseded despite date of rank by Hancock when he arrives on the field later. He's acknowledging that there are these reports that are coming back to him about the precarious situation of the First Corps. And so I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. But more directly to where we are in the battle at this point here, as the 11th Corps is starting to falter, you're right, Matt, it is starting to become this more sort of pincer movement. But there are a couple of things that play to the Federal First Corps advantage. One is that the Confederate advance, the successful taking of McPherson Ridge, it stalls. So that they can, freshen up the attacking force. That we're going to see that when Pettigrew and Brockenbrow take Herbst Woods and McPherson Farm, respectively, that as Biddle's brigade and Stone's brigade and Meredith's brigade have fallen back from McPherson Ridge, there's a moment where if that Confederate attack continues pressing forward, there's not really anyone ready to fully defend Seminary Ridge in great numbers. But as a lot of these soldiers would write, they literally lie down on the western face of McPherson Ridge and allow Pender's division to step over them. And that buys the necessary time for units like the 151st Pennsylvania. I'll let Jim tell that story. I know he loves to tell that story. For them to reconfigure in the swale between the ridges, and for this roughly 2,000 to 2,500 man federal force to reconfigure themselves behind this barricade that was nicely built for them earlier in the day by Paul's brigade, dismantling fence rails, taking down lower hanging tree branches, digging up stumps and rocks, anything that they could find to construct what Doubleday called a precautionary measure. And when we think about that barricade's parameters, it would have been about 300 yards long from the southern end of this building up to just across from the Krauth House. So it's a crude structure, but it can protect a lot of men, and that's going to be sort of the saving grace for this open field of fire as that attack begins.
Dawes was doing like the same thing over here, right? Constructing some barricades and whatnot when he was back here in reserve.
Yeah, so we're gonna see, basically, as they.
So you're talking about earlier in the morning, Rufus Dawes, 6th Wisconsin, they're here as a reserve for the Iron Brigade, or really for Doubleday's whole division, really, right? It's the only reserve he's got. Just for context for the people watching. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so they're going to be the first. As I mentioned, there's always at least one regiment here. And first it's Dawes in the 6th Wisconsin before they attack the railroad cut. And then we really see in earnest that there's this attempt at making this a defensive position when Paul's men arrive. But Dawes and the 6th Wisconsin are already realizing, if you're standing here for any amount of time, it wouldn't take long to recognize that, hey, if that line breaks at McPherson Ridge, this is the next place to defend. And the average foot soldier probably doesn't know this, but anybody who's in the cupola would attest that this is the last place to defend. You're going to lose that road network if you lose this position. And whether Doubleday goes up to the cupola, I don't think he does. He doesn't say that he does. Whether Reynolds does, Doubleday is the only account suggesting that he did, but Doubleday wasn't on this portion of the field quite yet. So Doubleday's probably just relying either upon his own observation from the ground, or he's probably getting some of that intelligence that other officers had gotten from up in the cupola as well. And it's becoming ever more apparent that even though when he's making this decision, it's still hours away from that position being lost. One of the things that McPherson Ridge, doesn't have that Seminary Ridge does is, I mentioned a moment ago, that open field of fire. McPherson Ridge is all wooded even on its western slope until you get north of Herbst Woods. But back here on Seminary Ridge, that and a lot of people have suggested, we get visitors a lot who say, why didn't Doubleday just fall back earlier? This is a more open field here of potential fire, but understandably he's following what Reynolds had set out as the plan for the Corps and by extension for the arriving army of holding McPherson Ridge as long as possible. But every unit that's in reserve here is thinking about what can we do with the time that we have. And we're entering that point in the war, of course, where if you have any time to prepare, dig in or build up if you have the opportunity to do so.
You mentioned the 151st Pennsylvania. Jim, you love the school teachers regiment. And we did a show about it. The school teachers with an apostrophe S, with an S apostrophe, or no apostrophe at all. We don't know. But we also know that it wasn't full of school teachers, right? It was just a handful.
No, but most of the guys in the unit were farmers, like most regiments. But there was a higher proportion of school teachers in that unit than really any other
normal.
unit.
Yeah.
And of course, George McFarland, the colonel, the commanding officer, was a school teacher himself.
So it could be school teacher apostrophe S then, because it's his regiment.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that.
We'll never know. But so what did they do?
Well, they're part of Biddle's brigade that arrives around 11:30 in the morning. And most of the brigade was sent out here onto McPherson Ridge, and they were held back here in reserve. They filled in the earthworks after Paul's men went north to support Robinson and joined Baxter. And, they're really interesting because if you're aware, there's 300 Union regiments to make up the Army of the Potomac. And the top number of casualties of any unit is the 24th Michigan. They lost like 363 guys, the next morning at roll call out of 599 answer. Number one, and who's number two? It's 151st Pennsylvania, whose monument is right out here, almost directly in line with the 24th Michigan. The two top regimental losses in the Army of the Potomac in the 3-day battle at Gettysburg, the biggest battle in half the world, are right out here. Basically, they were sacrificed. I like to think of that commercial where the narrator comes on and there's like a desert and all this dust is being kicked up and you hear the helicopter and the guy says, when everybody else is running from trouble, we're going into it. I guess this is an article. That's what the 151st is doing. Biddle's Brigade had been overlapped over here toward the Fairfield Road. Colonel Wainwright, the artillery commander, said, when he looked over there, he said, we were overlapped by at least a half a mile. That's what he said. And then each of the units in Biddle's Brigade from left to right began to fall back and expose the next one. And the 151st moved forward and basically slowed down the Confederates long enough for the Iron Brigade to get back here, rest of Biddle's Brigade, and actually set up a defensive line, one last defensive line along here. They're essentially sacrificed. They lost 337 out of 467 men, killed, wounded, captured, and missing.
And wasn't their time just about up?
Oh, you
get out of
stole my
Yes,
question.
there were 9. Don't you hate when they do that?
God, I can't stand it.
Yeah, a lot of the guys.
Go ahead, say it louder.
I just think that's the most powerful part of that, you know?
Yeah, he
Almost out, you know?
Their term of enlistment, 9 months, was for many of them was supposed to run out, but they crossed the Pennsylvania border, and we're about to fight a battle on home soil. We're not leaving. We're going to fight. We're going to defend our home soil. And you're right. And then how many of them never leave?
We had on display several years ago from the family of his first name is escaping me. I think it's Alexander. Last name is Himmelberger. Was a soldier in the 151st Pennsylvania. I might be getting his first name wrong. Nevertheless,
it's funny how you forget the first name,
right?
But you got the last.
I get Himmelberger.
Yeah. Himmelberger, right?
But it's fellow German. We had a series of letters from the family that were on display. I'm going to say 8-ish years ago, and I think it was 4 letters, a sampling from his letters in June, and the last one was somewhere around June 27th or so. And he's telling his family, I look forward to hopefully joining you for the 4th of July. And he's killed somewhere on McPherson Ridge or Seminary Ridge and is buried in an unmarked grave, likely in the National Cemetery. And so that's a prime example of that these men are days away from their enlistments running out and you know, almost 75% of them aren't making it off the field.
And am I remembering this correct, that this was their first like major or only major fight? Like they had a couple of scrapes, but this was like the big one.
Yeah, they had been at Chancellorsville, but they weren't really engaged.
Right.
Same thing with 24th Michigan.
Yeah.
They had like, you know, kind of like garrison duty and scouting duty and things like that in Northern Virginia. But you're right, this really is their first
so their
engagement.
first one, and they take what, 72% casualty, something like that, something crazy. I forget.
That sounds pretty close. I mean, whatever 337 and 467. Anybody got a calculator?
I saw 74 in one book. I saw 72 in another. I guess it depends on what.
72 sounds right, man.
Yeah, I think it's 72 July 1st, then they lose a few more casualties July 3rd.
Oh, okay.
That's right, because people forget they helped repel Pickett's charge a couple days later.
Yeah.
The survivors.
So, okay, the Union line collapses. Get us through there. Anybody have any questions or thoughts? Go ahead, Elaine.
I hope it's in line with where you are with the timeline, because I want to know.
Nothing has been so far, so it's okay.
I think I'm trying to rebase the timeline, right?
Yeah.
The 11th Corps, because I'd like to bring the story up to when Hancock and Howard have the conversation. And the reason that I'm interested in that in particular is how you've set Howard, right? He's listening to everything. He has a point to prove, I would assume, or he would like to prove a point, and then he talks to Hancock. And it'd be very interesting to talk about because, anyway, I've hopefully set the stage. So when does Hancock come on the field? Because that plays into holding the ground in Hancock's strategy.
It's probably about somewhere between maybe 4:30 and 5.
So things are falling back.
He arrives at the lowest moment for the Union Army. It's the moment when they're streaming through town and the survivors who aren't getting captured in town are getting up on the Cemetery Hill. All the bad deeds are in effect. Demoralization, disorganization, defeat, everything.
Diarrhea.
He arrives on the scene and he looks at Cemetery Hill, and at that low moment he says, yeah, this is where we're going to make the stand. And there is a little bit of tension there because Howard says, oh, you can't make that decision, I rank you. But Hancock had just come from Meade, and Meade said, I'm giving you, I think he gave him a note. He said, you have just been in contact with me. You know my most recent thoughts. You have the authority when you get there to make a decision of whether we fight there or not. And Hancock easily could have looked at that horrible scene of the Union guys retreating through the town and said, I don't think so, which is kind of what Slocum did when he got near here. And instead, Hancock stands up there and says, well, Howard, you put your men on this side of the line of the road behind the wall, and I'll put mine on this side, and we'll make a stand. And that kind of ameliorated the conflict. One of my colleagues was a retired Special Forces colonel. His name is Kevin Covenauer. He died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. And I'll never forget one of the things he said about Hancock's arrival. And they talk about Hancock being this inspirational figure, and he's wearing the white starch collars, and the men see Hancock and they're like, we'll make a stand, And he said it wasn't Hancock. He said it was what he represented. He's the commander of the 2nd Corps. There's 10,000 more men right behind him.
It's nothing to do with him, it has to do with
What he represents, a 10,000 man reinforcement. Yeah, we can make a stand because he's got 10,000 guys. Second Corps.
I feel better.
Can I pigeon on that? So I know I set the stage. How, as you've been living with Howard in your brain, obviously for a long period of time, Howard wants to prove himself, but he doesn't even have to look at the note that Hancock's got. He's like, I get it. You outrank me. And how many times are we like this? And like, I'm going to do the business. I outrank you, whatever my, subordinate, like I got this. So how do you think about how Howard, because gracious am I being too generous by saying that?
In that moment, I don't know how I would put my finger on how he feels, but it doesn't take long after the battle until Howard will feel vindicated by receiving the thanks of Congress for being, the official as close as we could get to.
In that moment to Hancock.
Yeah, and I mean that's the point where we have to remember that there's the personal side we've been talking about that's really important, obviously, but then there's also the official. You're following a military order from the commanding officer of the Army in that case. I think you also I think that to tag on to that point of Hancock is coming up with a fresh corps of soldiers. That has to be in Howard's mind as well. Is he's just seen this corps that he doesn't have a very high opinion of already has just broken again. And that's, of course, a point of personal pride for him. He knows that will fall on his shoulders likely. But he can't help but, while he's giving over, command of the field, he's also giving it over to someone who has fresh troops. And
do you think he's relieved too? Kind of that.
I think so. And I was going there with that too, because when we go back to the, several hours earlier, what is Howard's first reaction when he learns that Reynolds has fallen? He doesn't know he's been killed yet. He's been told, Reynolds is a casualty. Howard says, I hope it's not so. And that's, of course, partly because he doesn't want Reynolds to be killed. But he also seems like he doesn't want overall field command. He doesn't want this. And then ultimately, a few minutes later, he learns, of course, that it is true and that he is in overall command of the field. So yeah, I can't help but wonder if there's some semblance of relief there. I don't want to psychoanalyze him, but there's probably maybe something to that as well.
Yeah. Cody, I think we can maybe give Howard some more credit here, possibly. Let's see what you think of this. But I think maybe in that moment, he put the good of the Army ahead of what he was saying. We can sit here and argue, you and Hancock and I. Meanwhile, the Army's in bad shape, or we can say whatever we need to do to make a stand here.
Yep.
And I think maybe he can get some credit for that, for understanding the importance of the moment and putting his own ego aside.
And I think the other thing we have to remember about Howard, too, is that it is he who realizes, I think, first, more than anyone. Now, I'll caveat it with this. I'm not going to say that he was the first person to recognize the significance of Cemetery Hill. We have indications that Buford did and that Reynolds did, but Howard's the first person who actually put anyone there.
That's right.
And as the day wears on, he has to realize that means that there's no way that the Army of the Potomac can fight and win a battle at Gettysburg on July 1st and July 1st alone. That by this point in the day, you're fighting for this position to live and fight another day, whether that's to attack from or to defend if you're attacked. And so I think he's putting the good of the Army ahead of any sort of personal feelings by that point in time.
Rich.
Cody, just one last thing on Howard too. He approaches George Meade when Meade gets up here.
Mm-hmm.
He's worried. He's upset. And Meade and he have a conversation at the Evergreen Cemetery, and Meade tells him, no, it's okay. I'm not attaching any of this to you. You did a good job. And he doesn't relieve Howard.
Yep.
Howard remains the commander of the 11th Corps. Contrast that with Meade axing Doubleday with John Newton. Now, Meade has the authority to do that, but I think Abner Doubleday did a pretty good job here west of town. The only thing I've ever been able to find critical of Doubleday involves Hancock on Cemetery Hill, where Hancock turns to him and says, you need to send some troops over to Culp's Hill. We need troops over there. Doubleday has the D's, as Jim likes to say. He's demoralized. He's depressed. And he kind of, and Hancock gets him some Hancock. I said, send troops over there. I'm in charge. What do you think about, Doubleday?
Yeah, no, and it's one of those things where, like, yeah, I'll admit I'm a Howard apologist, but I'm also kind of a Doubleday apologist too, and those two things can feel mutually exclusive because of the back and forth between the two of them and that dynamic with Meade and with Hancock. But I suppose working in the building that was Doubleday's headquarters for part of July 1st makes me biased toward him as well. But I think that one thing, just from the perspective of, let's say you're arriving on the field that night, whether you're Meade or just literally anybody else, and you've been given the overall synopsis of what has just transpired to the best of your knowledge over the past 10 hours. I could see why it would appear as though the man who is now in command of the troops who are on the piece of the field where where this all began, and who ultimately was the successor to the man who committed the army to battle here at Gettysburg, that this position ultimately by the end of the day was lost. Despite the plans change, of course, Howard changed that plan as we talked about a minute ago, but if you're just looking at it from what was the initial plan to try to defend west of Gettysburg, and that has failed, I think that no matter whether it's Doubleday or literally anybody else, I think that's something that's going to go against them. It's going to be not in their favor.
And I can't remember where I heard this, read it, but isn't it true that Meade already didn't like Doubleday? Doubleday's lot was cast, no matter what, almost no matter what happened.
Democrat, Republican?
Yeah, that's, I think, part of it. But Howard would fit into that too.
Well, Doubleday was kind of in that cabal with Hooker and Sickles. They were kind of the political guys. Meade was, he was not a political general so much. Maybe that had something to do with it. But he gets word, as soon as it gets here from Howard, the Doubleday broke. Well, it's like we were talking earlier, in the conditions you're in, this man's been riding all day. He's got all kinds of stress. You don't have time to sit analytically and say, well, now you give his case, and you don't have time to do that. Doubleday broke, I'm going to relieve him.
The higher person. You're just tired and reacting.
Right. And so you hear Doubleday broke, so you say, I'm going to relieve him.
Yeah.
There's so much going on. You don't have time to be fair.
This doesn't tie into the Army Command, but it is an important point. I think over the past 2-ish years, I've personally started to kind of reconceptualize how I think about the breaking of the First Corps on Seminary Ridge. And I realized at a certain point, two or so years ago, you can split it into 2 camps. And it has everything to do with basically where the barricade stops. So when you look at barricade on down the ridge, south of that, there are woods there. There is thus not much artillery support. I think there are 2 guns south of where Valentine Hall is today, sort of between Valentine Hall and Schmucker House, for those familiar with that area. And then you have, Gamble's brigade is holding onto a stone fence down along Fairfield Road. And then north of the barricade, north of the line of trees here on the seminary campus, then you have this heavy concentration of artillery with some infantry support. Iron Brigade, Stone's Brigade, up toward the Mary Thompson House and the property surrounding it, ending effectively at the railroad cut. When you look at the primary source accounts from the Union forces who are just infantry, so Biddle's brigade especially, holding on to the barricade position, they see it as only a matter of time until they're going to have to break. They realize that at a point as the Confederate attack continues to their left, Confederate right, until it eventually creeps around the barricade and the 1st and 14th South Carolina push Biddle's brigade off the field. That's pretty obvious to them that, yeah, it was just a matter of time. It's a numbers game. It's an untenable position. But if you go read Rufus Dawes, if you go read, I think it's John Musser, the 143rd Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, they are shouting as they're receiving orders from Doubleday staff to fall back from Seminary Ridge. One of them says, "That is damned cowardice," is the line. And when we think about how could that be, that they're so close together, a couple hundred yards apart from one another. But what's the major difference? One has artillery support, the other does not. One has Alfred Scales's brigade in their front. Scales's men are absolutely decimated by this artillery fire. Perrin's brigade takes high losses. I think it's something like 50 to 60%, if I'm not mistaken. But it's not nearly the devastating blow that Scales's men suffer. And so, though they are on the same battle line, a couple hundred yards apart from one another, if you're in Biddle's brigade, it looks like, yeah, we're losing this position. But if you're in the Iron Brigade or Scales's brigade, it looks like you just won the Battle of Gettysburg. You just decimated that attack in your front. But Dawes says that what convinces him otherwise is that he turns to his right and rear, and he could have seen something that today the topography and the structures don't allow us to see, and that's that there's also this Confederate attack coming in on the 11th Corps. And so that's an important thing for us to tie those pieces together. Who knew what and when sometimes came down, not just to being on Seminary Ridge versus Cemetery Hill, but literally two positions right next to each other on this ridge.
So going to your point about Doubleday versus Howard, and especially Meade's reaction about Doubleday, what role, if any, does John Buford's message back to Meade about no one really being in charge here? What role does that have in potentially coloring how Meade sees Doubleday's performance here at Gettysburg?
I think it's a good point.
When I read the ORs, that message from Buford is probably the most riveting OR I've ever read, with his postscript of "We need help now."
Yep. Yeah. There appears to be no directing person. P.S. We need help now. Yeah, it's so dramatic. Yep.
Yeah. Scary.
Yeah. From a guy like Buford.
Yep.
Yeah, right. Sam Elliott.
And we
Sam
have,
Elliott, that's right.
Yeah.
we have Aaron
Sam Elliott never
Jerome,
panicked.
the signal officer, in his account to Hancock that he writes in 1865, which is the meat of what Matt and I talked about recently. He says, I never saw Buford more anxious, is the word that he uses to describe him. And so, yeah, I totally think that if you're hearing this, not just from someone who, the conversation we had earlier, oh, we're used to hearing this from that person, when it's the stalwart John Buford is telling you, we have no directing person, we need help now, his signal officer saying he's extraordinarily anxious, then I think that has to have a big impact upon someone. And I think that the fact that message is sent at something like 3:20 in the afternoon, that tells us that Buford doesn't have a high opinion of Doubleday or Howard or who is in charge of this whole thing is essentially what he's asking at that point.
Since you touched on Buford, if I could backtrack, I'd like to throw something out there you guys might consider it a little bit controversial. But, in the movie, Sam Elliott gets up there and dramatically talks about the high ground. And it's so inspiring. But I've always thought that what Buford probably recognized here, we're going back to pre-battle, was the road network.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think he realized that was the important thing. I'll tell you why. Because whoever controls the town of Gettysburg is going to be able to concentrate their army quicker in the face of the enemy. If the Confederates can get Gettysburg, they're going to get their whole army here first. And whoever concentrates quicker is going to have the advantage. And I think Buford saw that when he came up from the south. And I think Reynolds is actually the guy that probably saw the high ground, because he comes up the Emmitsburg Road, and what does he see? Big Round Top, Little Round Top, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill. He sees the high ground. What does he send? A message back to Meade. And he says, I will barricade the streets if necessary and fight them inch by inch. What he's saying is, this is the place to fight a battle. I'll hold him off. You bring the army up here. We can make a stand here. And Hancock later in the day, Howard confirms that when he comes up here and leaves the reserve, and Hancock confirms it when he makes the decision at the end of day one that, yeah, we are going to rally here. We're not going back south. This is the place to fight the battle. And I think Buford probably deserves a lot of credit for recognizing the road network.
And I think that the sort of coincidence that we have is that for both Buford and for Reynolds, the firsthand accounts that we have from them are messages that are given to an aide. And in both cases, there's a little bit of a question of what exactly did they mean. And for Buford's, his famous note that Jerome tells us he sent was, the enemy must know the importance of this position and will strain every nerve to secure it. And in the context of something like the movie in the 30 plus years since then, that emphasis on the high ground as being how Shera and Maxwell interpreted that, I think that has gone a long way into modern audiences and us looking, even if you go to the fourth floor and on the wall we have that line, the enemy must know the importance of this position. Oh, he's saying they're going to understand this ground. But in that moment, Buford himself says absolutely nothing about we're going to have to hold on to the terrain, to the higher.
He's thinking of roads.
He's thinking of roads. That's what the enemy would find obvious. He's saying.
Yeah.
And then for Reynolds, that's the Stephen Weld account where the barricade the streets inch by inch, hold them back as long as possible, and the progression of the recognition of the roads and then Cemetery Hill, I think is. We couldn't make up a better story for how it's such a lesson in how every person who arrives on the field adds to the understanding of why this entire place is significant. It's Buford saying, this is important not because it's significant to us to defend right now, but it's important because our enemy knows that this is important. That's why it's important for us to defend it. It's not because we can make any use of it, but because they could if we weren't here. And then Reynolds, when he arrives on the field, he said he doesn't say anything about defending Cemetery Hill, but he says fight through the streets inch by inch, barricade the streets. Right. So again, we're not going to defend it, but now we need to put in place a system by which we can stop them from using it. And Doubleday continues with that plan. Howard arrives on the field and actually puts soldiers there, and he says, okay, this is going to be where we fall back to if need be. And then when Hancock gets on the field, he says, all right, let's do something with the men who are here. And when Meade arrives on the field, what does he ask Hancock? What is your synopsis of this position? And Hancock says something to the effect of, I don't know that I've seen a better piece of ground in this war to this point, something along those lines. And so we can see that progression where that big question of, who deserves credit for that? But Howard gets the official thanks of Congress for it. But it's this amazing, despite the fracture in leadership, despite there being 7 highest-ranking officers as the day goes on, that they each build on that plan is pretty remarkable.
So, all right, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So how much? Okay, if Buford's about the roads, does Buford, I would assume, have at least an inkling that Meade's orders aren't to attack Lee, but to defend Baltimore and Washington? I'm nodding to make sure that my conjecture is, because that would lend, as I'm listening to you and understanding you, that I'm not, they're not coming to, battle Lee. They're coming to make sure they can defend Washington and Baltimore, which would mean roads are even more important than necessarily winning a battle. Now, I'm doing this a lot so you can see in my argument where there may be holes.
Well, remember, Meade is told 2 things when he's put in command at 3 a.m. on June 28th. The Confederates are in Pennsylvania. They're on awful home soil. Here's your chance to beat them. Go out and get them. Oh, yeah, by the way, the other part of your orders, always keep your army between Washington, Baltimore, and the Confederates. And that's one of the things I think that Meade doesn't get enough credit for. And he takes over 3 days and he does exactly that. But that was actually something I was thinking about. And that is, I think we should give Meade credit because he's smart enough to fight a defensive battle. He had established a very strong position at Pipe Creek, just over the Maryland line. And I think his plan is to try to get the Confederates to come and attack him. if it had to, if Lee hadn't followed, Washington would have been on his tail, and he would have had to come up here and attack. But he's smart enough to trust his subordinates. He trusts Reynolds' word. He trusts Hancock's word when he comes up here. And just like you said, Cody, when he got up here, well, what do you think, Hancock? What do you think about the ground? Is this good ground? They say in the movie. Hancock says, just what you said. I haven't seen anything better. And so Meade deserves some credit for that. But yeah, Meade he's told two things, always protect Baltimore, Washington, and go get the Confederates. And coming up here is taking care of that first thing.
All right, Lentz, go ahead. Last one.
And when Hancock, of course, goes back to the Second Corps, he also gives a dispatch to me that says the position is strong, but it can be easily turned on the left.
That's right.
Mm.
And that sets up day 2.
Right, thank you. All right, so what I want to do is let's go around the room. I want to know who your VIP is. MVP. Thank you. Of day 1, north or south, doesn't matter. Start with you, Elaine.
It has to be Buford.
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 Buford. Buford. Buford.
Hancock.
Hancock. Good answer.
Shabanowski. I gotta be different. Like, I did well.
No, you can say Buford if you want.
No, I want to say Buford.
What'd you say?
What is Shabanowski? I don't know. Mike Krzyzewski. He had his Blue Devils on. Krzyzewski, whatever his name is.
Krzyzewski. Are you just saying that to be different, or do you really mean
A
that?
little bit, but no, I think.
Okay.
I think
No, as long as you really mean
I
it.
think he did well, and that was, Jim mentioned a little bit. Jim mentioned at one point in time, but I just watched a video with our friend doing a old guy thing on it. So anyway,
I don't know what that was, but okay. 6 questions.
This is gonna be a bit controversial. I'm gonna say Howard.
Okay, that's fine. Rich.
I'm going to be a little different too. I've started doing some research on this guy, and Cody and I've talked about him a lot. I just have a real interest in him as John Reynolds. And I think Reynolds gets up here. I look at those dispatches he sends back to Meade about, I will barricade the streets and fight him through the town. Unfortunately, he gets killed. He gets all this criticism for maybe being too far forward for a wing commander.
Yeah.
But I think he's there in a fight, and that's why I like him.
I would like to make a comment here.
Go ahead.
That this, of all the days, it can be seen as a tactical Union defeat.
Right.
All our MVPs are Union officers.
Yes. Yes. Good point. Now, are we biased?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that there's another thing. I've always had this theory to that too. When you think about, like, if we were to make a Mount Rushmore of July 1st figures, I have a feeling at least 3 of the 4 I bet would be all Union officers. I think part of it is this: even though it's a Confederate tactical victory, there's 2 things at play. One, it sets up the strategic Union victory and eventually the tactical Union victory. But also, even if we were just right now looking at the Confederate side, who stands out above everyone? And I think it would be probably pretty difficult for any of us to think of like that one person to put at that MVP level.
Yeah,
it's
hard to come up with
a team
one.
effort if we're looking at the
But I look at it like there's a point where the Confederates far outnumber the Union, and it's just a matter of moving forward and shooting your guns at them.
Yep.
It doesn't take Napoleon to do that. Like we could all get together and do that.
And they take
Not
big
really.
losses.
But they take big losses doing it. Sure.
It's a Pyrrhic victory.
But so to me, that it is interesting that we all pick Union guys because they had the harder job. Like they have to hold the ground. They have to. They don't have a good position, especially Howard, as we talked about before.
But whenever
So-
they come up to some sort of issue or some sort of problem they have, they always seem to take the right road. Whereas you look at the opposite side, and the Confederates always seem to take the wrong road.
Yeah.
And it's always, to me, it always seems like it's communication. It's just communication. It's lack of what we were talking about in the beginning, where you look at the chain of command, and there just doesn't seem to be as much of a good structure.
Yeah, it seems to be that everybody's kind of doing his own thing,
Yeah, they're
right?
independent parts. Working,
Yeah.
And
Could we be extra controversial?
Go ahead.
So let's take it back to where you started. What is this day? It's setting the stage for the rest of the battle. So in that, did they win? Because guess who's got the higher ground? Like if they had the numbers, and they were supposed to do this, and they didn't get it together.
That's a very good point because
Is it?
Yeah.
because
I'm
is,
open
No,
to
I-
disagreement.
because is Lee in possession of the field?
Right.
He's not in possession of the field.
But that's
No.
why he didn't want it from the beginning, because he wasn't ready.
No, but I said this a couple times on a few shows, and the guides that have always been with me looked at me like I had four heads. But I'll say it here. Buford, he's doing the delaying action for Reynolds. But I look at the 1st and 11th Corps doing a delaying action for the rest of the Army. And whether somebody said at that point or not, we're just going to mess around out here, but we've got to hold Cemetery Hill. It doesn't really matter because that's what ended up happening. And as we pointed out, Howard at least saw the importance of Cemetery Hill by leaving the reserve there. So at least Howard, when he came on the scene, yeah, he's like, we got to do something here.
Let's revert. Let's go back to if practicable for a moment because we got to go back there for a second.
Okay.
Because I'm going to argue that day one is a loss
For who?
for the Confederates. And I'm going to argue that because Lee, I've gotten wind, I've not done my full research, didn't really like to go toe to toe with his generals. So the if practicable was as close as he would get to saying, you got to go do it. And so Lee had miscommunication in what his intent was and he hesitated on general engagement, but once he understood what it was, like all the Union did, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? Double day, they had the confusion, but once they realized we got to hold it, they at least got it together. Lee never got it together. He never went to those generals. He never said he wanted it, and he lost a moment.
So it's really
For
like
discussion?
July 1st is considered a Confederate victory simply because they sweep them from the field they fought on, but they swept them to better ground.
They wanted,
Yeah.
they wanted to take him.
So-
It's a tactical victory, but a strategic defeat.
Yeah.
But one of
That's much more succinct. Thank you, Jim.
But one of the things that makes it a strategic defeat is the decision that Meade made, which is he's staying and fighting.
Right.
Say again, Mike?
He's staying and he's going to fight.
Yes.
That is what turns July 1st from what could have been a complete victory to a strategic, eventually, defeat for the Confederates.
Well, here's something else to think about. And I've been thinking about this throughout the night. And I can't remember if it was on your show, if somebody said it on your show.
Just
or if I heard
pretend it
somewhere
was.
else.
We'll say it was.
Yeah, we'll say we heard it on your show.
Yeah.
But
Oh, right. Yeah. If it's
there
bad.
was the argument was.
There's another show?
It could have been an old CWR. But the argument was made, and I don't know all the details of the argument, that day one of the Battle of Gettysburg was actually July 2nd.
Yes.
The battle here was actually the Battle of Willoughby Run or Marsh Creek. That this was a separate battle. The Battle of Gettysburg was a 2-day battle, and it starts tomorrow and goes the next day.
There's a good chance it might have been me who said that. That's based in how a lot of veterans thought about
Yeah.
this. So, for instance,
You said that on my show, I think.
I did, yeah. And
See, there was.
It probably
Was my show.
it probably comes up again in that Jerome conversation we had.
Yeah.
That because Jerome does this. So the first time we get an account of Jerome talking about Buford being in the cupola, meeting with Reynolds on the ground around the seminary, is 1865. It's a letter, and then in 1867, it's published in a book, and he expands on it. And this book is by J. Watts de Peyster, a military historian from New York. And it's part of a series called Decisive Conflicts of the Late Slaveholders Rebellion. And the Gettysburg volume is called something to the effect of The Battle of Oak Ridge and the Battles of Gettysburg. And the chapter that Jerome writes for that is called Buford in the Battle of Oak Ridge. And he entirely separates July 1st as a totally different battle than
Why?
July 2nd and
Why
July
is
3rd.
that?
I think in part that's I'm trying to think if it was, I think it was Thomas Desjardins. However, I've never been certain how to pronounce his last name. But the book These Honored Dead, the story of Gettysburg in American Memory, whatever the subtitle is, fantastic book for those who have not read it. It explains a lot of why we think we know what we think we know. But he makes the point that on the flip side of the lost cause, there's the cause victorious, which is that, Union high command never did anything wrong, and is one tenet of it. And one way that veterans talked themselves into their victory at Gettysburg was, we lost not the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, we lost the Battle of Oak Ridge. We won both days of the Battle of Gettysburg. And it doesn't.
Series.
Yeah.
It's a baseball series.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's like a baseball series, or it's like Cemetery Hill was the goal line, and we let Lee's army go from the other 25-yard line to the goal line. We didn't let him over the goal line, kind of thing. So it doesn't really take hold beyond that first, I'll call it, decade after the Civil War. But if you go look at a lot of early regimental histories, of early monument dedication speeches, memoirs, those sorts of things, a lot of veterans use that term, the Battle of Oak Ridge or the Battle of Willoughby Run.
And you think it's two distinct, like this is the battlefield.
Yeah.
The next 2 days all happen in basically the same place, different parts of the same place.
And you have the leaders on the field. Like that to me is when we started the conversation. That's why I wanted Jim's thought on it. To me, it's always, I'm still, a freshman in this subject, but to me, it was always the run up, right? And then it happened once Meade got on the field. Now, okay, we're in this because Lee didn't have a plan. He didn't have a plan until, or at least an approach until day 2.
I guess you could look at it that way.
And it's an interesting point you raise about both commanders not being on the field. Is there's a debate in the Maryland campaign, historiography through for the past 160 plus years of was the Battle of South Mountain actually a major battle? Can we classify it as such? And one thing that a lot of historians will say is, if you don't have both army commanders on the field, it doesn't belong in that category of a major battle. And so that's one way we could, I don't agree with it personally, but we could think about July 1st in that way. And I think that's one of those things we so often want to, people will critique, well, people bring up the lost cause today, or they bring, whatever it might be, but it's a classic case like the lost cause. These are things that we're not conjuring today. These are terms that are coined by the Civil War generation as they tried to explain what it was that they experienced. And this debate over July 1st being its own battle or being part of the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg, that's one of them. It's, like I said, not one that takes hold. It's really sort of abstract, but it existed among a certain percentage of veterans.
That's interesting. All right, now what I want to know is from Jim and you. Jim, who's your MVP for July 1st?
Okay, I don't like the question.
Oh,
because
forgive me.
Well, now
I didn't know that was an option.
it's like saying, who's your favorite child? All you guys have pointed out people who are heroes here: Hancock, Howard, Buford, Meade to some extent. It's like Little Round Top.
Yeah.
Chamberlain, great. But if it weren't for Vincent, Chamberlain would have been there. And if it weren't for Warren, Vincent wouldn't have been there. Why do we have to pick one guy? I mean, why can't we give
don't.
the credit? We share the blame on the Confederate side, I'm not defending.
My feelings are very shattered right now.
I understand your question. If you push me to the wall, I'll say Buford, because if it isn't for Buford, nothing else happens.
That's my point.
Why is this business of the first day being separate from day 2 and 3? Here's my answer to that. If there's no first day, there's no second and third day. There's no official, there's no battle here.
That's true.
Well, I did not expect to
Don't get me ticked off about the first day, man. We're all first day guys here, right?
Yeah.
First day, baby.
Yeah. Wow.
And one way,
And you, Buford, too?
What? No, hold on.
Oh.
So what I was going to say is
gonna yell at me?
to your point. No, I'm not going to yell at you. Not about this, at least. I have other things to yell at you about. Is whenever somebody asks me, you know, that sort of question, MVP, that kind of thing, how I sometimes reconceptualize that is, you know, whose impact do you feel made the most significance? That is, if you were to pull one person away from it all,
right?
Really?
What else is impacted?
Then Buford.
Say Howard.
Yeah, and so for me, that would be Howard, I think. But I think on the Hancock point, this is an interesting thing that I had never considered until right now. See, who all said Buford? Raise your hand if you said Buford.
I said Buford.
So at least half of the room. So
Jim
that
half
would be the
says
person
Buford.
who that would be the person who most people would credit as their MVP. Well, what did your MVP say was his MVP? Hancock. And that comes to us from Jerome. Now, Buford, of course, dies in December, but when Hancock writes his note to Hancock, when Jerome writes his note to Hancock in 1865, he tells him, this is of course secondhand, but he says the person who Buford wanted on the field more than anybody else was Hancock. And so I think that that's an interesting way to think about that, is that everybody else's MVP, you know, the MVP, if you will, of July 1st, he says his MVP is Hancock.
I would argue, though, that our MVP, he is because without the decisions he made, he could have said, oh yeah, they're a cash town, and like gone back somewhere else, like down to Emmitsburg or something. Like he could have not done what he did, but he did it, and it led to, and it was of course a chain event that led to the Battle of Gettysburg, but eventually the Confederate Army was soundly defeated here because of the decisions that Buford made that started it off. I'm right, you're wrong. Thank you everybody for watching. No, no, but really we do have to wrap up anyway. So anything else? Any final thoughts that you guys have on July 1st?
Who else should we be paying attention to? You can hear we're all studies. Who else should we, other than the 151st, who else should we be looking at?
That we haven't talked about?
Yes.
Okay, my MVP on the Confederate side. John
Gordon.
He's overlapping the Union right at Barlow's. No, he's
you know,
not
that's
doing
one
too
of
bad.
our more popular shows. People love that one.
Well, good.
That's why I started doing more biographical and brigade episodes, because people loved your John Gordon show.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, I really want to defend Howard because I think that he hasn't gotten the credit he deserves, and I think he should get it. But I'm a big Meade guy.
Yeah.
And I'll leave you with this. You know, Meade did trust his subordinates and came up here on day one and said, okay, we're going to fight here. And I think it's something that happened 160 years ago last week at Appomattox when Grant and Lee met and agreed to the surrender. But before they had the surrender ceremony, Meade was there. A lot of people think Meade got fired. He's still at Appomattox. And he has to go through the lines to meet with General Lee, and he gets permission to do it. And so they talk, and they talk about the fact that they were in the Mexican War. And Meade looks at Lee and says, I don't remember you being quite so gray. Yeah, you know what comes next. And Lee says, you have to answer for that. And you were just talking, Codie, about other people's opinions. Well, I think General Lee's opinion of Meade says it all right there.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a good way to end it. Oh,
I'm sorry.
No,
If you wanna edit that.
you know,
I was
you
gonna
take
say,
my showmanship away
if we
from
want
me.
to take it the whole way down to, you know, other figures who maybe, you know, you should read at the lower ranking level. So two regimental commanders whose firsthand accounts are exemplary to me, who we don't always think about. One is Robert Beecham, not a regimental commander, but a company commander in the 2nd Wisconsin. He writes a book simply called The Battle of Gettysburg in 1913. It's a while after, but extraordinarily quotable, great firsthand description of what it's like to be in a regiment in the fight on McPherson and Seminary Ridge. And then on the Confederate side, Joseph Newton Brown, who is the commander of the 14th South Carolina, he writes a book called A Colonel at Gettysburg in Spotsylvania. His daughter ends up publishing after his death, but he gives as good a Confederate account as any that comes from July 1st. So terms of other people to focus on who are not the obvious ones, I would say that Robert Beecham and Joseph Newton Brown, one on each side there, are worth a read.
How about you, Jim? Any reads?
Yeah, actually, I would. Now that you mention that, Cody, I direct you guys to go upstairs to the second floor and look at the wall and read the story of a 19-year-old student at the University of Lewisburg, adjutant of Company E, 142nd Pennsylvania, Andrew Greg Tucker, who is wounded 3 times out here and instead gives his horse to Jeremiah Huffman, was it?
Yep.
Huffman makes it back here. Tucker makes his way back here, dies here in this building like on the 5th of July. He's buried in my hometown where my parents are buried in the same cemetery, and I went up to see him today. And that's somebody that's very personal to me. I think that kind of, oh, you got to read the quote. He said, I'm a young man, and I don't want to die. I'd like to see my sisters again, but you probably know the quote better than I do, Cody, but I'm willing to die for my country.
He says, I would like to see my mother and sisters again, but I know I never will.
I know I never will, yeah.
That's sad. All right. Thank you guys for coming out. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I enjoyed having you. Thank you very much.
Matt.
Thank you all for watching, and we'll talk to you next time. Tomorrow, actually, July 2nd.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, forsooth 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa or drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail, no man for debt shall go to jail from Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa or drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail, no man for debt shall go to jail from Gary Owen in glory.
Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, we have a lot more content for you over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Also, you can make a tax-deductible donation to help support more videos like this at dhpioneers.com.